The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So we're trying to get more and more of the 2020 Democratic candidates on the show, and we would love to have all of them on. That would be a really great thing. We've already interviewed Richard Ojeda and Andrew Yang, and unfortunately, half of the 2020 candidates we've interviewed have ended their campaigns. Richard Ojeda, who was on the program recently, has ended his campaign. He put out about a 1.5-minute video stating, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, that if you're not rich and well known, that you don't really have a shot at being president, that it's not true that anybody who wants to can be president, that you do have to have certain influence and financial resources, and that he doesn't want people continuing to donate to his campaign, given that they are not getting any traction and it's not going to get going. So we knew from the beginning, Pat, that Richard Ojeda had no chance to become president of the United States. But though I'm sort of surprised that he ended the campaign so quickly. You would have thought that there would have been a benefit to him as a West Virginia state senator, or generally towards his public persona and kind of like public awareness about him. I would have guessed there was an advantage to staying in this thing longer, but very quickly ending it within just a couple weeks of other candidates getting involved.
Yeah, me too. And that's why I do believe his reasoning that he really just doesn't want good, hardworking people to contribute to his campaign when he knows that it's not going to get off the ground. And that is quite honorable of him to do. He actually recently resigned that position as state senator, so who knows what he's going to do now. I thought this campaign really never had a shot. And part of the reason why is because he doesn't have the name recognition. Like, I think usually when you're running for president, in this day and age, unfortunately, you could either be a celebrity, you could take the Donald Trump, Oprah Winfrey, Dwayne Johnson path, or you have to be like a governor, senator, maybe a prominent congressperson like Tulsi Gabbard or Ron Paul, something like that. But if you're just some state senator from West Virginia, it's gonna be a tough battle.
Yeah, and I mean, you sort of, when you interview people like Richard Ojeda, out of politeness, we have to sort of accept the possibility that the guy could be president, right? Because otherwise we're part of the problem. If I just bring him on and say, listen, you don't even have a shot, why are you running? I'm kind of reinforcing the narrative that unless you are in a certain privileged position, the likes of which Pat described, the characteristics that Pat outlined, I'm kind of reinforcing it, right? I'm making people, even more people, think that because he lacks that status, he can't be president. But at the same time, we recognize that things haven't changed so drastically in our electoral system since the last election that Richard Ojeda is not going to be president of the United States. So it's always a little awkward during the interviews. And sometimes people will write to me, Pat, and they'll say, David, why don't you just say to him, you obviously have no chance. Why are you even running and taking people's money? And I have no problem with confrontational questions, as anybody who's watched this show for a while knows. But it seems like that's not even in the spirit of the way that we would like to believe the American democratic system works.
I feel like everyone's in on it. Like, we know that they don't really have a chance. Even they know that they don't have a chance. And that's why these people tend to be single issue candidates. Like Andrew Yang, he's running on the platform of universal basic income. Larry Lessig, the Harvard professor, he ran back in 2016 on the platform of campaign finance reform. So that's all well and good, because even though you don't really have a chance of winning, other candidates in your party could adopt the position that you've championed, and then that's a net win. And I think maybe that's what Ojeda was trying to do with, I think also with campaign finance reform, putting body cameras on lobbyists. He had some good ideas. We'll see if they get adopted by some of these other candidates.
Yeah, body cameras on lobbyists is not going to be a big one. But I still am sort of hopeful that Andrew Yang can build more of a campaign than Richard Ojeda did. And we're going to have him back on the program and we'll talk about his campaign. I actually think it would be possible for Yang to eke out early a few percentage points, which maybe would get him in some early debates. Like, I know it's wishful thinking, but I actually don't think it's totally out of the question.
Yeah, I mean, he had that first to the market advantage he declared like a year ago, and he has some name recognition, right? He's a rich entrepreneur, so that's going to help him too. If he campaigns well in the right states, in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, he could get off the ground potentially.
Yeah, we will see, and he'll be back on the program in the next couple of weeks. We're working out a date with him now. Here in the US, the topic of the border wall continues to be controversial. We had a government shutdown over it. We might have another government shutdown over it come February 15th if Donald Trump doesn't get, I guess, what he wants, some kind of deal that he likes or whatever. Denmark is also preparing a border wall of sorts, and it's a border wall with Germany, but it's meant not to keep people out, but rather wild boar, a sort of wild pig, from crossing over. And we've talked about wild boar in the past. Overpopulation problems with wild boar in a number of different parts of the world. And the concern here is not one related to people directly, but it's an environmental concern. Because what environmentalists are warning is that this 5-foot high, 40-mile fence will harm the region's wildlife, and it might not even actually keep the wild boar from getting into Denmark. And this is so if you don't know about the circumstances in Denmark, and many people may not, although I know we have some Danish viewers, Denmark has twice as many pigs as people. They have about 12 million pigs and just under 6 million people. And their pig export market is huge. And the introduction of these wild boar from Germany is causing a possible health risk to the Danish pig population. In other words, the pigs, the wild boar coming in from Germany don't pose a health risk to Danish humans, but they pose a health risk to Danish pigs. And that's why Denmark is considering erecting this wall, although now there's sort of a question as to whether that wall would be effective at preventing the spread of pig disease. So very, very controversial stuff going on in Denmark, Pat. I wish that this was the only border wall discussion that we were dealing with here in the United States.
I worry that the border wall won't work because I think that these wild boars in Germany are just going to come over via plane and overstay their visas. That's the issue that we have here. Only 40 miles long, though, and we're talking about a 5-foot high fence, some like $12 million. That all seems reasonable. Like, I'm not against a border wall, if we're talking about to keep illegal immigrants out. I'm not against it on any moral basis, but it's just more about practical concerns, cost concerns. The U.S.-Mexico border is one of the longest in the world, and, you have the Rio Grande going through much of it, so it's just totally impractical to build a wall across there. But if our southern border was, only 40 miles long, I think I would be in support of some fencing for it.
Yeah, concerns here, much like here in the United States, in Denmark, are mostly environmental and will it actually work? Environmental because the wolf species of the area may be restricted from their sort of natural migration routes, and that could be a bad thing environmentally. And it also affect the ecosystem and the sort of food chain on down beyond the wolf. But also, it's not clear that this would prevent the spread of the pig-borne illness. You would still, even with the construction of this boar border wall, have relatively close proximity between the wild boar of Germany and the domesticated raised pigs of Denmark. And it seems that other carriers could still move the disease in on through. So we'll see what happens. It is $12 million, which is, 12 million versus 25 billion for the American border wall. It's a very, very small amount, but people should remember that the Danish economy is also much, much smaller than the United States. So 12 million in Denmark is like much more than 12 million here in the United States. We'll see what happens with the wild boar crisis on the Germany-Denmark border. Okay, let's talk about people's food shopping habits. There's a very interesting study that I read over the weekend by the American Heart Association and the International Food Information Council Foundation, which says that even though almost all grocery shoppers are at least sometimes looking for healthy options when they go grocery shopping, only about a quarter say that they find it easy to figure out which are the actual healthy products that they should keep buying. And for me, the big problem is the term products. Basically, the healthy stuff isn't what we would call products in the modern industrialized sense. I don't know if people call carrots a product. Pat, when I read that word, people are unsure about which products to buy. Most of the healthiest foods aren't what we would think about as a product.
No, you got to go with the whole foods approach. When you talk about like carrots, that's great. That's produce. Same thing with lettuce and fruits and all that stuff. But yeah, it gets tougher when you're talking about prepackaged stuff. And my general rule on it is to take a look at the label. I have to do that anyway because I'm a vegan and I have to make sure there's no animal products in it. But if there are like a bunch of ingredients that you can't even pronounce and they just sound like chemical names, it's probably not good for you.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that is not universally true, but ideally, most of the foods you're buying don't even have an ingredient list because you're literally just buying a food. Now, the other thing that the study points out is that a lot of the confusion right now in grocery stores is from very deceptive marketing. Now, at the grocery stores that I go to, I actually don't see this type of marketing, but it clearly is happening because a lot of people are citing it. Sometimes you will see bananas advertised as having no cholesterol. And this will sometimes be confusing because bananas simply don't have cholesterol at all. It's not a product that has cholesterol. But some people start to think, oh, this is a particular banana that's a cholesterol-free banana versus a banana that has cholesterol, which of course is not a thing, right? I mean, it's just a banana. Banana is not a food that has cholesterol. And that type of labeling, the labeling of fruit as gluten-free, it's just fruit, right? It's not a particularly gluten-free food. It's fruit and it doesn't have gluten. All of this labeling is extra confusing to consumers.
Yeah, and in other realms, I think this is just clever marketing. But when you're talking about something as important as food, I think we have to be a little bit more clear. There has to be plenty of government regulation so people know what they're buying. When it comes to labeling and processing and everything else, the FDA is considering putting a healthy stamp on some of these foods so you would know if it's actually good for you or not. That could get dicey and bureaucratic, and there could be some corruption there. Like if, Kind Bars company wants to come across and make sure that they have their food labeled healthy, and the guidelines suggest that it's not, I think that could get kind of dicey.
Yeah, and even more problematic. I mean, we've seen those. Like for a while, there was a program called Heart Healthy, and it might still be around. I don't know. I just feel like I don't really pay attention to that type of labeling at all. But at a certain point, the guidelines for something being heart healthy simply meant that it had to have either low fat or no fat or only unsaturated fat. I don't remember what it was, but those fruit leather candies, I think a particular brand, didn't have fat. Of course, it had an insane amount of refined sugars and all sorts of other stuff. They qualified as heart healthy, which of course gives the impression that it's a generally healthy product to be eating. And of course, that's so extraordinarily deceptive. So in this case, I feel like more labeling and lists of what are the healthy products only lends itself to even more sort of big food companies and big agriculture and the big food producers like General Mills and all of those different ones taking advantage of it to even further confuse people. So what we get back to is education. I mean, it's just if we started truly informing people at a young age about what is a diet that makes sense, that's really the only path forward, Pat, that I can identify that really solves the problem.
Yeah, and I think these healthy stamps, that would work for like squash. It would work for an avocado. You can sign off on that and be totally fine with it. But then you talk about foods like bread and meat where it's unclear whether or not they're good for you. It depends on what your diet's like already, what your cholesterol levels are like, and your blood sugar and all the rest of it. So it really depends on the person, and it's not really something that you can streamline by just putting a stamp on it.
No, you can't. I mean, as far as how certain foods would relate to people with particular medical conditions, I mean, that's a totally, unrealistic standard that foods would be labeled on the basis of this food is generally healthy, except if you have these conditions. I mean, at some point, I almost become like conservative where I say that's starting to become like serious nanny state stuff. But I think the most important thing is most of the foods that we are buying should not really have packaging on which you should be able to even place these labels. Now, I know like with the squash, okay, you might put a sticker on the squash, or maybe on the price tag sign, you add some kind of label or whatever. But I think the general point I'm making is we should be getting most foods that are not the types of foods that are packaged in a way where there would be a ton of literature or marketing claims made about them. But this is an ongoing problem. It's been going on for decades, and it's quite frankly getting worse in a lot of ways because of a lot of the new processed food products that are out there. And actually, there's a very interesting study, and this applies to a lot of vegetarians and vegans, where there's this thing that happens where things get labeled as free of X, right? This doesn't have soy. This is fat-free. This is dairy-free, or whatever. And a lot of people interpret that as meaning this is good for you merely because it's lacking something, where that thing that it's lacking is not necessarily something that's bad for you. And this is where a lot of vegetarians and vegans end up eating really bad stuff, which is they pick up items that are marked as free of animal products, dairy-free, free of all this different stuff, but they're filled with all sorts of preservatives and emulsifiers and all sorts of different stuff. And I know, Pat, that this doesn't happen to you because you're completely up to speed on what does and doesn't make sense with a lot of these diets. But that's a real problem for a lot of vegetarians and vegans who end up sort of making an unhealthy turn because they end up getting all of these highly processed products that don't have any of the things they're looking to avoid, but are what we would call factory foods.
Yeah, I know you totally wanted to sandbag me with that comment, but I'm not one of those vegans or vegetarians. I take a good look at what I'm putting into my body. Some of that stuff, though, like if it's labeled dairy-free, well, maybe you're just a person who eats an otherwise standard American diet, but you have a dairy intolerance. So it could be perceived as being labeled dairy-free to make it look healthy, but really it's just to appeal to those people who have those niche diets. That's what I think it is in part.
Yep, certainly that is the case with some of those labels. Okay, that's it for today. We'll have a new show, a new bonus show tomorrow. We are here all week, and then the Patriots are in the Super Bowl over the weekend, which is very, very exciting, and we probably won't talk about it much on the bonus show, although we may have an interesting interview that will be sort of related to football coming up later this week.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.